To our first conversation now, South Africa, the world's second biggest citrus exporter, has requested the World Trade Organization, WTO, to establish two panels to adjudicate disputes over its citrus exports to the European Union, EU. South Africa challenges EU measures implemented to combat citrus black spot, a fungal disease, and the spread of the false codling moth, which damages the fruit. This marks South Africa's first ever request under the WTO's dispute settlement system. South Africa exports about $1.8 billion worth of citrus annually, with Spain being its biggest competitor. Well, joining me for more on this is Clive Ramathibela-Smith, Senior Executive Partner at Hecare Capital and Partners. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Patricia. Thanks for having me.
All right, I want us to sort of begin by, maybe laying a foundation, yes? We might as well sort of begin by looking at these phytosanitary measures for citrus imports and how this sort of affects South Africa.
The South African citrus market has done great advances over the last, I would say, 25 years to meet high quality standard internationally, to make sure that the standard operating procedures from the local market right through to exporting have been regularly rechecked, reaffirmed, and to have some serious quality controls with regards to how we do export. In actual fact, if you look at just in industry as agriculture, some of the best products that you will find actually in the world come from this part of the world. So it is a very, very interesting change or a shift that now we find ourselves that South Africa has to now do an appeal to the WTO to try and regulate and reframe the work that were regulations that have recently just emerged from the European Union. It's sad, it's petty, and it's anti-competitive behavior that has reached us to this point.
But when you say it's sad and then it's anti-competitive, I'm looking at the fact that the new measures require a lot of things, talking about, enhanced cold treatment for fruit due to concerns over this false codling moth, and also a pest commonly found in sub-Saharan Africa. Talking about all of this, isn't this something you want to consider? I mean, will you say that South Africa has done the necessary check, has actually gone through this whole phytosanitary measures before saying this?
I think, Perpetua, the issue here is that I don't think there's any South African farmer, or citrus farmer for that fact, that is saying, no, these regulations are incorrect or shouldn't be introduced. I think that they understand that the measure that is required to get food quality, food security, and standard operating procedures to make sure that people receive quality goods. That is not the issue here. The issue is the terms in which they are being introduced, the time frame that's been allocated, and the question is always the why now. But you're not going to get any straight answers out of the EU on that. What you will find is that as the second largest competitor in the market, with 1.8 trillion rands worth of goods, it is competitive, and therefore we know who's number one. And it's no surprise that it would support an EU structure to have this level of regulation been introduced at this point in time. And I think to put you back into perspective here is very, very critical as business and administration and people who understand how international trade works. Similarly to what the WTO would understand, is that there needs to be fairness of open market play. And if we want to say we want to do a free market, we want to be supporting of business and development, we need to be very careful that we don't start to stifle others simply because of anti-competitive behavior. In this instance, I think it's fair, yes, to require a quality standard. However, it's how you introduce it and what time frames you put in place to make sure that everybody meets the quality criteria that is required for you to be able to do trade on an international scale. So the cost involved alone to the South African farmers, who actually, if you know, hire some of the highest number of people in this country. So therefore, that means that you would have to cut down on jobs. You'll have to cut down on production. You'll have to reinforce your already highly competitive structures to make sure that the quality that's been produced meets the international or the new regulations, as it were. So we're not saying that that's not the right thing to do. We're just saying the time, the cost, and the people required for this to be amended or to be introduced is far too extreme and smells of just simply a raw deal and anti-competitive behavior.
Okay, now you mentioned something. You were asking why now. I'm wondering if you probably have an answer to that. You're wondering why the EU is doing this at this point in time. Maybe you have a perceived answer for that. I mean, I might just sort of help this conversation.
Well, Perpetua, we are celebrating 30 years of democracy in South Africa. We pride ourselves with the quality of goods that we export, right from our raw materials in terms of our commodities, throughout to our agricultural sector. We have no problem at all with meeting quality standards. The question of time is relevant in this state because we were given minimum 6 months to adhere to these ridiculous restrictions. I mean, honestly, you have to understand everything in agriculture is cyclical. It means that you have to produce those goods in a particular time. You need to allow for seeding. You need to allow for harvest. You need to allow for production to take place and processing to take place. For the fact that we have not been given enough time to respond, that in itself speaks volume to what the actual intent of these kind of regulations are supposed to do.
Okay, so let me get you correctly. You're talking about time now. So are you saying, in essence, that South Africa hasn't actually imbibed by these measures that are being churned out, or that was churned out by EU recently?
Do you remember this journey starts, by the way, about 12 months ago. It's not like the black spot is a new phenomenon. We've known this, and there are other producers. We're not unique to it. I'm talking about other smaller participants right in South America, all the way into Asia. The European Union structure, we know that South Africa exports 90% of that citrus directly to the EU. And so therefore providing regulatory framework and knowing that part of the EU that is formulated has to do with the number one producer, which is Spain, who actually have the monopoly on this particular product in the EU. The question is, yes, we want to make sure that we are regulated. We want to make sure that we meet standards. We want to make sure that we produce quality, but we must all meet the same standards across board, irrespective.
When you talk about we must all meet the same standard, I'm tempted to ask you if you are aware of other countries that are probably excluded from meeting this particular standard. Talking about Spain, Spain is, of course, from Southern Europe, and it's the largest producer, of course, of this particular item or this particular produce. Talk to me, this particular law, how does it affect other countries?
Well, it would be amiss for me not to mention the contrast that we have with what the standards actually require. You'd have to remember some of the bulking that has been produced or that's been introduced into EU have to go through these bypasses, and there's nothing wrong with that. The thing is that South Africa has been a very massive competitor in the space. And so even if you look at all the makeup of the entire citrus farm or import-export market into the EU, South Africa holds a very significant number. And that's why it's been affecting mostly the domestic farmers in Spain, as you rightfully mentioned, and the pricing has also been very competitive. Now, by introducing these regulations, it supports the local farmers in Spain, but it excludes anyone else. And yes, it might be applied to across board to Asia, to America, but the point is, it will affect the second biggest, largest exporter, producer, which is South Africa. It will affect them mostly simply because they have a lot more to lose than the rest of the world.
Well, talking about having a lot more to lose, that's because they probably export over 30% of their citrus to Europe. Well, this is actually the first time, South Africa has progressed a dispute at the WTO beyond the panel state of the established dispute settlement, body process. What are your expectations from this?
I expect a fair and honest and transparent procedure. South Africa has gone on the world stage. We are fighting against, for example, with the ICC. I don't think Europe likes us at this moment because we're talking about what's happening in Israel and in Gaza. We are fighting about what is happening further across the world because we understand that business and our relationships are very important. We have been making a very serious foreign policy. We've just gone through an election. And so we want to make sure that our consistency in terms of policy, our consistency in terms of economics, our consistency in terms of the message politically that we're sending, and our foreign policies match that across board, including in business as well. And so I'm hoping that the WTO and the EU and the Commission will understand our point of view and relax some of the restricted measures that are required. The reason why, by the way, it's two-pronged is to make it a bit more fair, so that you have two panels that listen to both sides of the coin. So we are hoping that we'll have a transparent and a very robust and fair, equitable structure that will look at things from both sides, including looking at elements like food security and fair competition in the business world globally.
All right, so are you looking at something? I'm just looking at, I mean, we would say normally that if one door closes, another opens. Isn't South Africa also, isn't South Africa considering maybe other options, other markets, you know, that it could sort of go to if the outcome isn't as expected?
Perpetua, you make a very good point, but can I just remind you, to do a transition or to do a conversion of business, to do turnaround, it's like trying to turn the Titanic. And so therefore, there's a lot of effort that needs to take place before you can actually turn the entire direction to new markets, to developing markets. So because of the tradition of how South Africa has been positioned, including our ports, by the way, we have always magnified them and we've always put emphasis on where we do the biggest export. And so we will at some point have to diversify. I agree with you, but it will also take time. And unfortunately, these regulations affect both the time, the quality, and the response required from the South African farmers to meet these other new markets that are available as well. Like you said, you close one door, one must open, but it can be a heavy door to open.
All right. So the last time we checked, the EU did not accept South Africa's request for the two panels. Do you think this will in any way affect the proceedings? Because, I mean, the EU, on one hand, is confident that its pest control measures were entirely justified and that it would succeed in any dispute proceedings. So should South Africa be bothered about this, or what argument or counter-argument is South Africa presenting here?
The core of the matter is there are no new arguments that are being made other than those that have already been presented, remember, about 8 months ago. What has happened over the last few months is that they've intensified and the quality of produce has not, by the way, deteriorated. All that's happened is that they've now said, no, they're not going to do that. But unfortunately, that does not seem fair to the South African farmers. It needs to be transparent, it needs to be independent, and you need to have a fair trial or a fair hearing to listen to both parties. And we're not saying, like, by the way, Perpetua, just remember this, South African farmers in the associations are not saying they don't want to meet the new criteria or the new standards. They're saying the time in which they have been asked to change these regulatory frameworks is a challenge. And also remember, there was already stock that had already left South African shores when this regulation was formed. So what happens to those billions that have been lost in stock that has already arrived at the shores of Europe? And that is what the challenge is. If you are anything but fair and you want fair competition, you have to listen to that story from both sides and have an equitable decision that will support both parties so that we can have an amicable decision.
Absolutely. Talking about this, there are other international trade challenges that South Africa has sort of faced recently.
There are a number of challenges that we're facing. For example, you would know, particularly in the mining sector, we have some of the biggest mining companies closing down in South Africa. That's been a big challenge for the local market and international market as well. We've seen as well, unfortunately, the demand for power and energy that has created new markets that South Africa is not necessarily prepared for. But there are others as well that have done very well, Perpetua, and we mustn't forget that. So we are seeing a South Africa that has to now balance between having to make sure that they meet regulatory framework internationally, but we must improve our domestic positioning so that we can have less and less targets. By the way, the BRICS domination, which was extended a few months ago, also has produced a new door, like you had said. And so the regulatory framework has altered and has changed over the years, making it even more competitive for markets like South Africa, which is an emerging market and not necessarily an advanced economy. So we do have challenges, but I believe that if the policies are put straight, and right now we're waiting for the president to announce his new cabinet, which is for the first time going to be a government of national unity. Well, it's the second time around, but this time we are hoping it's more sustainable. The African National Congress has lost its majority rule in parliament. And so there's going to be new elements that are going to be introduced that South Africa is not necessarily used to. But it's good that even though the cabinet has not been called, things are seemingly still working. Government is still working. But we expect that when that happens, Perpetua, that will help stabilize the country, increase foreign direct investment, and make us more competitive, particularly in the agricultural spectrum, because that supports mostly the common people or the poor people of this country.
All right, in closing, how might this dispute sort of influence future trade relations between South Africa and the European Union, irrespective of where it ends?
Irrespective of where it ends, we want Europe. It's a particularly stronghold for South Africa in terms of export. We have an amazing trading partnership with them. Not just this one issue should therefore demoralize our efforts to try and make sure trade is fair and equitable for everyone. However, I must just add this, Perpetua, because this is very critical. The advancement and change of regulation and framework needs to be fair. And when you introduce policies, when you introduce directive, when you introduce quality standards, similarly, like we're experiencing, I'm fortunate enough to be sitting on the council that's doing the cannabis and hemp structure for South Africa, which is just legalized. Those things are very elementary. They need to be met with fairness, with equitable distribution, and make sure that people understand what the law is, and the kind of standard that you want to reach must be also across board. So I'm hoping, as this developing democracy continues, that we'll have better negotiations, better trade relations, and also we must try and trade more with Africa. And we've been saying this a long time ago. We've been saying if we had a market here domestically that was strong on the African continent, then we wouldn't need the likes of meeting the standards of the EU, for example, to be able to be more competitive. So Africa needs to trade more with one another and create its own space and economic hub so that we can be able to be more competitive even when we go outside our borders.
Thank you so much, Clive Ramathibela-Smith, Senior Executive Partner, Hecare Capital Partners. Thank you for your time on the show today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Perpetua.